This is the death metal album that I have been waiting for. This is what I have been wanting all along. Holy shit. Hey, what's up, horror freaks, gorehounds, headbangers? Welcome to the Splatter Cafe, where we talk about extreme horror books, extreme horror movies, and extreme metal. So this is my 2024 best death metal albums. It's a pretty specific list. I'm not talking about metal generally. There's not going to be any black metal, deathcore, power metal, things like that. I'm just focused on death metal, and in particular, I like old school death metal and brutal death metal. So no offense to those other genres, but that's what this list is going to be all about. And this is also very guided, obviously, by my personal taste. That goes without saying. There's a lot of great albums that are not going to make this list that fit those genres. For whatever reason, these are the ones that I connected with. And of course, if you like what you're seeing, please go ahead, hit the like button, subscribe. If you hate what you're seeing, downvote the shit out of it. I don't fucking care. All right, coming in at number 10, we have Malodorous with the Carrion Recoil, their August release on Amputated Vein Records. This is slamming brutal death metal, disgusting sci-fi, aliens, gore, squishy shit, and I fucking love it. So this album starts with a sample from Event Horizon. At first I didn't notice it because it was slowed down, and it's Sam Neill doing his monologue about entering hell, and it's gnarly, and it kind of spooks me a little bit. Sets the tone for the record. Throughout this whole thing, you're just going on a journey through space hell. Now, it should be said, sure, this isn't deep, intellectual, layered songwriting, but man, that's not what I go to slamming brutal death metal for. Anyway, I go for like the sick gut punch. This album totally delivers on that. And I also want to say, sure, it's not complex songwriting, but there's a lot going on the surface. It's really varied. It keeps you interested. Some people say like, oh, I want a No Frills album. This album is packed with frills, and I love it. Sirens, squeals, samples, and it all just like builds this atmosphere to deliver this sick, slamming, brutal death. I'm loving it. Another interesting thing to me about this music is just how far it pushes the slam, the slam aesthetic. The drums are so fast, they almost sound like they're electronically programmed. It might just be like really intense, fast click track drums. But on the one hand, it has this electronic music feel to it in that sense, kind of the way the songs are structured too. But there's these really dirty, guttural, gory vocals and really dirty, thick guitars. And those two things going on at the same time, to me, is an interesting contrast. It kind of just keeps me invested. We have this like space age atmosphere, but it's full of blood and guts and disgusting aliens tearing you to shreds. And yeah, the style captures that perfectly. So another good call that this album makes is, okay, they do their first 4 or 5 songs, and they shift the style a bit from song to song, but you're kind of just getting different versions of the same thing, but I'm loving it. I'm just eating it up. And then at that point, they bring in new guest vocalists for every song who share vocal duties with Cyber King, Malodorous vocalist. And it works nicely because it shifts things up and the song's style shift a bit to accommodate the new vocalist who steps in. And you get great people like Angel Ochoa of Cephalotripsy and Abominable Putridity. You've got Vlad Martisov of Extermination Dismemberment. You have Kane Galasnik from Vomit Forth. And again, it adds like a little spice, a little variety to these songs. It just keeps you engaged through the runtime of the album. All right, so bottom line, I find this album really fucking entertaining. I just love throwing it on at any time. It's a good midnight listen if you just want to watch a disgusting B-movie about aliens fucking and ripping each other apart. It's like the unrated Alien movie that H.R. Geiger was never allowed to direct, but if he had made it, this is the sonic equivalent of what that would sound like. It's kind of like an accompaniment to that infamous hell sequence from Event Horizon that got made and then cut out and lost, that was just too disgusting and transgressive and just went way too far for the producers and audiences to handle, so they thought, this is maybe the album equivalent of that. It's just fucking disgusting from A to Z, and I love it, and that's why it's on the list. All right, so coming in at number 9, we have Florida Death Doom Freaks Wharflurch with Shittier Slimier. This came out in June on Gurgling Gore Records and Dawn Breed Records. Like an idiot, I didn't discover this until I think October, November, and that was my loss because this album is fucking awesome. apparently between other projects, somewhat recently, they were recording these tracks in like a makeshift recording studio, and then they set them aside and revisited them later and kind of perfected them. But they have like the energy of a garage band, just like sitting down and figuring shit out on the fly, and like this is the first time they're doing this, but this is being done by seasoned musicians. Wharflurch has been around since 2019, so they know what they're doing, but this album captures that sort of like letting the editor brain go and just experimenting, and it's a pretty awesome product that they came up with. So kind of like by necessity, because of the way the album was recorded, it has a kind of lo-fi feel to it. If I had to compare it, it sounds like maybe the earliest Autopsy records, although to me a little bit more listenable than that. But I like that about it. It kind of adds to the grimy, spontaneous, high energy atmosphere. So I'm totally down with the production of the album, the sound of it. So if you like death doom, particularly if you like early Autopsy, you gotta check out Wharflurch. They have a bunch of great albums, been around since 2019. I think I like this as much as anything I've heard by them. And I keep comparing them to Autopsy, but they really do their own thing. Autopsy is, you know, more like you're in a shit-smeared dungeon. This has that grimy element, but it's also like psychedelic. So sure, you have these like churning mid-tempo, slow, grimy riffs. You have these really like growled percussive vocals, freaking like one of the highlights of their music. But then you have this ethereal psychedelic quality through these, you know, out of nowhere, these clean vocal harmonies. And the really cool thing is those two elements, it's not like a good cop, bad cop thing where it's like, okay, we'll have a grimy part and then we'll have a pretty part and we'll kind of go back and forth. No, they sort of blend together. The pretty parts are still kind of grimy and the grimy parts are still kind of elegant, and they tie together in this package where, yeah, it's a bad trip, but you don't want it to end. So you guys, another thing in this fucking album that I'm loving is the songwriting, the pacing. So important, obviously, for death doom. You're not drawing people in with these crazy surface pyrotechnics. It's all about you're evolving this slow, plodding structure, and they just nail it on this album. A lot of these songs start out with sort of like a grimy mid-tempo groove, and then it builds slowly over the course of the song to like this frenzied climax, and they throw in all those elements I was talking about along the way, some surprising melodic guitar solos, maybe some clean vocals here and there, the synths come in to amp up the intensity, and they just do that beautifully over the course of the album. They indulge that sort of psychedelic side more and more. The songs get sort of looser in structure. The jamming parts get jammier and longer, and the last song, kind of the perfect example of that. It's just this, I think it's like 9-10 minutes. They stick with these like a couple simple motifs, but they just keep changing. They keep exploring them from different angles. The drummer just is tearing it up. You have these guitar solos. You have these synths coming in to like deepen the mood. So yeah, pretty freaking original stuff, I think, here. This psychedelic death doom, just the extent they take it, and that, again, garage band energy, that almost like jam, and I feel weird saying jam band while I'm talking about a death doom band, but I don't know, they pull it off somehow. It's fucking original. It's just a blast. And so that's why this one is number 9 on the list. All right, number 8, we have the debut full length from the Finnish death metal band Ashen Tomb. This is called Ecstatic Death Rain. This sort of feels like you're wandering down a demonic, fluorescently lit labyrinth of skulls. Now this style is hard to sum up. It's old school death metal for sure, but it ties in a whole lot of different elements, maybe most notably kind of like proggy songwriting, even though these songs aren't super long. It also flirts with death doom. There's also like brutal death metal elements here, which I'm loving. These kind of like pig squeal style to the vocals. The vocalist kind of shifts different styles, but it gets pretty brutal. There's a lot of super intense blast beats. So anyway, a real grab bag of styles, but they're blended really beautifully. Okay, so yeah, the songs aren't overly long. I mean, a lot of them are like 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes, but they just hit a whole lot of different registers along the way. Blast beats, chugging grooves, layered guitar leads. In fact, those are some of my favorite elements of this album, is the way they layer these really appealing guitar leads. It's hard to say. I said melodic, but sometimes they're dissonant, sometimes they're melodic, sometimes they're both at the same time. That really wins me over. And again, this vocal style, at times it's kind of old school death metal. You can hear what the vocalist is saying actually, and there's other times it veers into these incomprehensible pig squeals, and again, just like the breadth of styles that are tied together here is fucking awesome. I believe it's track 3 or 4 called Anamorphosis is where I go from digging this album to fucking loving it. Okay, it starts like a lot of the other ones have with these appealing mixture of some doomy riffs and some old school straight death metal and then some fast blast beat brutality, and then these melodic guitar leads layered, and it's great. And then there's this really groovy breakdown. It kind of reminds me of like a Tool song, not any particular Tool song, just has that kind of vibe to it. Again, that feel just kind of comes out of nowhere, but then it joins with the rest of the song so beautifully, and I'm just going on this journey with these songs. And again, yeah, it's not where they start, but it's where they go. It's the journey they take you on. It just works beautifully. For me, at least, track 5 can be a very tricky place on death metal albums. This music is such an endurance test. It's so punishing. And maybe by track 5, I've heard everything a band has to do, so I'm still getting punished, but I'm not getting the reward, and the punishment outweighs the reward, and I start to space out a little bit. That doesn't happen here. Like I said, they have this proggy DNA, and they lean into that, I think, more and more as the album goes on. The doomier parts get doomier and slower, and it just kind of progresses. They're indulging that kind of like psychedelic side, and that keeps my interest. They're taking elements of different genres, and they're not just throwing them together to make a random grab bag, but they're piecing them together to make like a compelling story. So you start with doom metal, and you end with like a full-on brutal blast beats, and it's just fucking awesome. Okay, and then the last track, they nail it. They stick the ending. I fucking love it. It's a respectable track, as good as any of the others, but then the last 2 or 3 minutes in particular are this, I think, the most melodic guitar work of the album, but that's the place for it. And, you know, it's like a little bit of a sweetener there at the end to take you home. All the elements that I loved about the album are in full force on that last song, and it ends beautifully and puts a smile on my face, and fuck yeah, boys. Beautiful debut. I'm excited to see where these motherfuckers go from here. I think they've got a lot of great albums in them. So anyway, that's why Ashen Tomb number 8 on my list. All right, let's do number 7, Coffin Rot. These are maggot stomp motherfuckers from Portland, Oregon. This is their sophomore release, Dreams of the Disturbed, and it's 32 minutes of gory, old school death metal, and yeah, what's not to love? They do it perfectly. Chugging riffs, it has caveman simplicity, it has punky, straightforward, deadpan vocals that get campy just when you want them to, it has melodic guitar leads and solos that add some kind of like surprising emotional depth, and every time those hit, it makes me smile. Okay, so old school, gory death metal, we've all heard it before. So why is this on the list? It's just they do it so well. Every ingredient is there and hits exactly when I want it to. The blast beat comes in when I want it to. The guitar breakdown comes in when I want it to. I don't know what to say. Somebody had to have the best gory old school death metal album of 2024. This year, it's Coffin Rot. But yeah, seriously, what kicks this album a notch above for me is the songwriting. It's tight, compact, effective, mindless, artfully crafted caveman romp. I mean, what more do you want? I think for me, track 3 is probably the highlight, Lurking in the Cemetery, just because it goes hardest into those kind of like 70s hammer horror, misty graveyard, campy, without being silly vibes. So that one is probably the highlight for me, but every song delivers one degree or another on that promise. Once you hit track 5, I feel like that they get harder and heavier and faster. So it keeps my interest all the way to the end. Every time one of those melodic guitar solos kicks in, usually after like the second chorus, it's functioning kind of like a bridge. I just want to stand up and cheer. It puts a smile on my face every time, just kind of like ties the song together. And that's sort of my philosophy of songwriting. If you have like a kick-ass bridge, you know you've got a good song. So this whole album is like a fun 70s hammer horror that starts out kind of old school and then gets darker and grimier and gorier than you expected it to, kind of like some of those movies do. The last song has a sample from a Twilight Zone episode, The Howling Man, which is just hilarious and kind of dark like the album itself. So yeah, fucking great sophomore release from these bad boys. And yeah, I'm excited to see where they go from here. Will it get weirder, trippier, campier, darker? Who knows? I'm excited to find out. There we go, number 7 on the list. All right, so coming in at number 6 is Necrot's Lifeless Birth. So this is old school death metal from Oakland, California. This came out in April on Tank Crimes Records. This is their 3rd full-length album. And yeah, just a really mature album from a mature band. They never sound like they're experimenting or just figuring things out. It's all very confidently done. You can hear their influences, but it all sounds like Necrot, unmistakably sounds like them. You put a track on from this, you know exactly who you're listening to. So a lot of the virtues of this album are kind of like what I highlighted on Coffin Rot's album, but maybe just like kicked up a notch. Really tight songwriting, really appealing riffs, and these melodic guitar solos and guitar leads that come in maybe like 2/3 of the way through the song that kick it up a notch. They really get you cheering, really gets me into it every time. Yes, you know, old school death metal, this isn't the first, this isn't the last, but what wins me over in particular about Necrot, I think, is just the amount of musicality they cram into these riffs. They're all very much in the genre. They never are showing off. It's all about the atmosphere. It's all about the songwriting. But with repeated listens, you just appreciate those riffs, how intricate they get. They get a little bit longer, a little more involved. There's more packed in there than you'd expect them to. It just makes for a really satisfying listen that you can keep coming back to. Okay, I have to call out Drill the Skull for probably the most hilarious, funnest shout-along chorus in death metal in 2024. If anybody can top that, please let me know. Track 3, Superior, has maybe the funnest, catchiest outro riff. Just really gets me cheering every time. Yeah, I think this is my favorite old school death metal album of the year. They just fucking nail it on every level. Like I said, a really mature album. So thank you, Necrot. Keep churning them out. All right, coming at number 5 is Wormed with their 4th full-length studio album called Omegon. This came out, I believe, in July on Season of Mist. And this is brutal death metal with a capital B, technical death metal with a capital T. Yeah, this is insane, dystopian, sci-fi, robot, brutal, technical death metal. So in my opinion, the flaws of an artist are sometimes also their strengths. They're totally impossible to separate. A critic who hated Edgar Allan Poe said, yeah, Edgar Allan Poe is like a writer who can only play the low notes. That's my criticism. And then to me, I'm like, yeah, but that sounds so fucking cool. Like a musician who only plays the low notes. So I think you could say the same thing in a way about this album, for me at least. I'm not a huge lover of technical death metal. A music critic I like said, well, to me that tech death just sounds like zeros and ones. It doesn't mean anything to me. It's not emotional. It doesn't move me. In a way, that cold quality of this music is what makes it so fucking cool. It feels detached and robotic and dystopian, and the cold technical style of the music really serves that. At the same time that that's there, they inject it so full of ferocity and intensity and just good old-fashioned musicality. Wins me over. Okay, so I said this is brutal death metal, but it's not super heavy on the low end. They're really all over the place with their riffing, with complex dissonant harmonies just all up and down the register of the guitar. And it has this kind of like jazzy feel to it sometimes in the same way that Meshuggah does, although Meshuggah kind of like wants to hypnotize you with these repetitive kind of minimalist structures, and Wormed is more interested in using some of those same tools, but they just want to bludgeon you to death. Okay, a lot of these songs have this like start-stop quality to them, this stuttering element. It feels like a computer that keeps starting up and then shutting off, and starting up and shutting off until it gets more and more frenzied and then like catches fire and explodes. These songs are just moment to moment are very unpredictable. You're not like, okay, here's that part of the song. I know what they're going to do next. Ah, they nailed it. It's constantly catching you off guard. There's parts where they're all doing their own thing. The bass is doing its own sort of riffing, and the drums are playing around it, and the guitars are layering crazy leads on top of that. And then they'll all come together and start just pounding away the same pummeling riff, and then go in other directions after that, stop on a dime, start with something totally unexpected. And that could sound sort of maddening, but again, they sort of have a way of unifying all these elements by the end into a really satisfying song. All right, so this is another one I'm happy to say. They absolutely nail the last track. It's the longest track, it's 7.5 minutes, and all the elements that made you love the album until then get intensified. They do it even longer. If they put out another album after this, which I really hope they do, I could see they have a lot of room to grow even after such an intense and fully realized album as this. And for all its excess and ambition and intensity, the album feels kind of like compact and pithy at the end. And I think that's probably the biggest compliment I can give them, is they're so ambitious and wide-ranging and dense, but it's so engaging that it just kind of like flies by. Fucking love this shit. That's why this is number 5. All right, so coming in at number 4, we have Malignancy with their June release Discontinued. Came out on Willowtip Records, and this is intricate yet punishing brutal death metal that deals with biohorror themes about the terrors of being a decaying biological organism. All right, so Malignancy, classic New York brutal death metal band. They hail from Yonkers, and their 1999 release, Intrauterine Cannibalism, a classic of the genre, their debut, and this is their 5th full-length studio album, and at this point, they have nothing left to prove. They are monsters of the genre. So people inevitably compare a band's latest release with their debut or their most heralded album, and I think in this case, I like how Malignancy isn't trying to reproduce the glory days. They're not doing like a repeat of that same frenzied balls to the wall energy of their early albums. I mean, sure, it's still super intense, brutal death metal, but it's a bit more layered, a little bit jazzier. So in a way, it's kind of like apples and oranges. Which album of theirs do I like the best? I don't need to choose. I love their first album. I fucking love Intrauterine Cannibalism. This album is fantastic too on its own terms. So Malignancy has a very distinctive brutal death metal style. They're kind of in the mid-register, not all low ends, but a lot of mid-register guitar work. The bass is very forward in the mixer, so you really hear what's going on. The interplay between the guitars and the bass is always really rewarding. The riffs are always very clearly defined, very jagged. The time signature is always shifting, so you can never really get comfortable and settled in a groove. It's always kind of shaking it up, while it also feels like this unbroken texture that they're kind of maintaining and constantly weaving. And one thing that I really appreciate their riffing is that, yes, it has this like jazzy element, and sometimes they get these quasi-melodic melodies, but it's also just really punishing and just straight up obnoxious. And these songs, they just sit there and writhe around. They don't progress. They don't have any dramatic shape. They just sit there like these tortured animals writhing around for 3 or 4 minutes, and then they die. And that description is not a criticism, far from it. That's one of the things that I really appreciate about this music. It's no frills, total honesty, total integrity, just laying it out there, not trying to make it pretty. It is what it fucking is. Okay, so because this band is so technically proficient, they can mix it up in all kinds of interesting ways. So you'll have passages where, say, the guitar is playing almost like a rhythm instrument. It's just laying down this monotonous pattern, and the drums go crazy around it, doing like free jazz soloing, and then they keep switching it up. The instruments play different roles, not always the ones that you'd expect. And so, yes, it's kind of, this album is an unbroken series of walls of brutal death metal sound, but within that there's a whole lot of variety and interest going on. And just on the kind of uncompromising nature of this music, I could not sing for you a single riff from this album. You could play me a song and ask me to sing back a riff. I don't think I could do it. They're so jagged, they're so unmusical slash musical. They're, the rhythms are just so off kilter. It's disorienting, just like being in the presence of this music. Yes, I enjoy this music, but it's not something that you lay back and settle into and let it wash over you. This is music that you endure it. You sit there, you suffer with it, and you fucking love it. Okay, so I should say something about the lyrical content of this album. So Malignancy is a band obviously very committed to biohorror as their kind of animating theme behind their music, so I'll just read you a couple of song titles from this album: Existential Dread, Irradiated Miscreation, Decomposing Divinity, Biological Absurdity, so you get the sense of what this album is about. If Wormed writes about the horrors of an infinite intelligence, the horrors of the mind. This is about the horrors of the body, the horrors of being a decaying, human, disease-ridden biological entity. Okay, so that leads me to the vocal style on this album, which is really unique and interesting. I'll be honest, the first couple times I listened to it, it was a bit of a turnoff for me. I loved all the other aspects of the music, but it took me a while to get settled in with the vocal style. It's not that like barking percussive brutal death metal, or it's not the sort of incomprehensible gurgling. You can make out what the vocalist is saying. A lot of these words are very clear, and the vocals just sort of float over the music. It's almost like this deranged preacher giving an insane sermon while the music goes along. It sounds like someone kind of having an existential breakdown. They've just realized that they're gonna die and they're a human body that has that's destined to suffer and then be extinguished forever. And all of these horrible thoughts surrounding those ideas are just passing through their head, and they're rambling and they're half asleep. But anyway, after I listened to it a bunch of times, I really started getting drawn in. It's one of the things that marked this album as a special one of the year for me, this unusual style that presents those lyrical themes, the biohorror themes, in a way that's pretty impactful. I can't think of another band I can go to that will create quite this feeling. Certainly not another band that has quite this style. So fucking love this shit. I'm gonna be listening to this for years to come. I know it, and that's why this, again, number fucking 4 on the list. All right, let's talk about album number 3. Let's talk about Defeated Sanity with Chronicles of Lunacy out on Season of Mist. This album came out in November 22nd. We waited all year for it, and it did not disappoint. Okay, so Defeated Sanity, they need no introduction. They are the reigning kings of, how should I describe it? Free jazz, super fucking brutal death metal blended together. This album is just more proof that they deserve their title. There's a sort of hard-charging, full-throttle, straight-ahead brutal death metal with crazy blast beats and gutturals, and they absolutely crush that every time they do it, but they also have this dissonant, complex, almost like free jazz element too. And all their albums kind of incorporate these two elements to one degree or another. Sometimes they lean more one way, sometimes they lean more another. Their 2016 Disposal of the Dead / Dharmata, it's this album where they just kind of split it down the middle. That half of it is the craziest, most satisfying lizard brain brutal death that you can imagine, and then the other half is just like wild free jazz. It kind of sounds like at a lot of points. And while I love that album, this album to me is even more rewarding because it takes those two things and they start to blend together in a way that you can't separate them. So I'll hear these riffs and I'll be like, whoa, that's a crazy brutal riff. Wait, that's sort of like a jazzy riff, right? And then I can't categorize it. So quite an accomplishment, and that's what made this album so incredibly satisfying. And just to beat that dead horse a little bit more, I think what I'm trying to say is this music, it's complex, but it never feels cerebral. It never kind of pushes me away and I just have to contemplate it sort of in an intellectual way. It's every riff, every song is a gut punch. They just know how to deliver extremely complicated, rich, deep gut punches. Okay, and I'm just gonna add one more final thought in my little Defeated Sanity worship right here, which is, as complex and punishing as these riffs get, they somehow, I don't know how, they always feel like elegant and musical at the same time. It's this weird thing where it almost goes down easy. Now, it's not, in no way is this an easy listen, but when I listen to this album, I don't feel punished and like I need to rest, like I want to listen to it again. The first track on the album, I just listened to it 4 times in a row because each time I got to the end, I was like, whoa, that was cool. I don't think I caught everything. Let me do it again. And the only reason I went on to the second track was because I had to listen to the whole fucking album to talk about it. But yeah, it's like infinitely revisitable music because it is so beautifully put together. All right, so very hard to pick a favorite track on this album. It's just bangers wall to wall, but I have to give a shout out to Condemned to Vascular Famine. That song, I think, has some of the most hard-hitting, ferocious blast beat sections, but it also has some of the most interesting, contrapuntal, multi-layered, jazzy sections. So, and Condemned to Vascular Famine, it's about fucking vampires. So, you know, that's a winner. Okay, so as the title promises, Chronicles of Lunacy by Defeated Sanity, this music is not sane. It's not music about madness. The music is madness. When you listen to it, you go temporarily insane, and there's nothing like it out there, and there never will be, and that's why this is number 3 on the list. All right, so coming in at number 2, arguably the best death metal band of the 21st century. I'm talking, of course, about Nile and their August release on Napalm Records, The Underworld Awaits Us All. Okay, so I want to start by saying technical perfection and virtuosity is not the reason to listen to this album. Yes, it has incredible technical perfection, remarkable virtuosity all throughout, but there's so many better reasons to love this album. So the album starts with 3 absolute bangers, 3 full-on classic Nile death metal tracks, and I'm fucking loving them. Now what's cool about these is that they're covering familiar territory, but they keep punching in surprising directions. I keep hearing riffs that they work perfectly in the song, but they're kind of surprising. It's not always what I'd expect to hear on a Nile album. Along those lines, I'm thinking about track number 2, the one about how not to be hung upside down in the underworld and forced to eat shit. You know the one I'm talking about. And about halfway through the song, it comes in with this riff that just kind of catches me off guard. It sounds almost like a thrashy riff. It's a bit more like playful than a lot of their typical riffs. So I'm definitely butchering that, but the riff is something like that, and every time it comes in, it just kind of catches me off guard, and it injects this fresh energy into the song, and that's what happens again and again throughout this album. I'm grooving along, I'm hearing stuff that I'd expect to hear on a Nile song, and then something comes out of left field and just gives it this new, fresh jolt of energy. Okay, so those first 3 tracks, absolute bangers, but fairly familiar Nile territory, sort of punching in surprising directions here and there, but then you hit track 4, and from that point on, the album gets weirder and wilder, and I think the most interesting new element they start adding at that point is this intense, clean vocal chorus that kicks in, and sometimes it's melodic, sometimes it's dissonant, sometimes it's kind of like triumphant, sometimes it's kind of ghostly, but whenever it comes in, it feels really shocking, and I just have to smile every time it happens. Because I'm like, holy shit, this is a Nile song, but I didn't expect this, but it's fucking working. It just adds so much of that cosmic horror, cinematic ancient Egypt atmosphere, and it just heightens the song, and it just kills it every time. And what's cool is that they don't use it in a predictable way. Like sometimes it comes in towards the end of the song to emphasize this like shouted, repeated refrain. Sometimes it comes in at the beginning of the song to kind of like switch up the atmosphere. And so they're always using it in different ways. And so it's this surprising element that comes in and it kind of shocks you every time it does. So in a lot of ways, this album is giving you the Nile you know and love, but they add these fresh elements, these bold kind of surprising things that to me just really elevates it, kicks it up to another level. So in addition to those cool, surprising, quasi-melodic choruses that come in more and more on the latter half of the album, it just keeps surprising me in subtle ways as well. Yeah, just in so many of these songs, they come in with a riff that's not what I'm expecting to hear, and it kind of throws me off guard and gives a jolt of energy. So things I'm thinking about would be like Overlords of the Black Earth. It comes in with this kind of like proggy era death riff, which is something that I'd never expect to hear in a Nile album. And it kind of hits my ear a little strange at first, and then I'm like, no, I'm all in. Give me more of this. And they do. Another instance of this would be True Gods of the Desert. Starts with this kind of like bluesy grunge riff. I feel like almost like I'm listening to a lost Soundgarden track or Alice in Chains, and then it kind of grades into a echo of Metallica's Sad But True. So yeah, all these surprising riffs, and again, every time they come in, it just kind of gives you this jolt of life, jolt of energy, and it elevates the album. So one of the ways I know this is a classic album is just the number of times that I hear a track and I'm like, you know what? This is the best one on the album. And then we get to the next track and I'm like, you know what? That one might be even better. And then a few tracks later, I'm like, no, you know what? Hands down, this is absolutely the best one. So that just goes to show, yeah, quality songs all throughout the album. They keep developing them, keep taking them in surprising places. So at this point, I'm so close to this album, it's hard to objectively place it in relation to the rest of their discography. But I have to say, for me right now, this goes toe-to-toe with the best of their albums. I like this as much as anything else I've heard by them. I think what it does so well, again, is integrating that ancient Egyptian vibe with the death metal vibe. I mean, that's something that they've been doing all throughout their career. Sometimes it's kind of like they have these interlude tracks that kind of set the tone and they go into a death metal song. I think at their best, they're kind of mixing those two together, and that's what this album is absolutely doing in spades. absolutely nailing that synthesis. Okay, and one more little piece of Nile worship here. Their riffs are so jagged and fractured and compelling and layered. They're kind of like what would be a typical death metal solo on another album. That's like a riff on a Nile album. And they take these complex riffs and then they just develop them throughout the course of these long songs, and they break off a piece and develop it in one direction, and then it comes back in all kinds of surprising ways. So yes, they've got this full-on headbanging intense death metal, but with this complex, really satisfying musicality. So yeah, this album just hits on every level. It gives me exactly what I would want from a classic Nile album. It adds some new, fresh elements that just every time I hear it, it's gonna surprise me. And so for that reason, fucking love this one. Gotta be number 2 on the list. All right, so number 1 on my list, best death metal of 2024. It's gotta be Vitriol's Suffer and Become. This came out all the way back in January on Century Media Records, and I fucking loved it when it came out. It blew my mind. I had never heard anything like it. I don't think I'll ever hear anything like it ever again, and I loved it this entire year, and it stayed number 1 on my list. So I was watching an interview with the band, and one interesting thing they said was, Vitriol should never be an easy listen. And that is just a really important thing to know going into this album. It's not an easy listen. It takes your full concentration and it punishes you. But if you can stand there and take the punishment, then it ends up also being incredibly rewarding. And yes, it's very dark and pummeling, but it has this also like defiant, triumphant energy as well. They're kind of in the vein of, say, a band like Hate Eternal, just really intense death metal, blast beats wall to wall, rarely if ever letting up. But Vitriol does that same space, occupies that same just energy up to 11 all throughout the song, but they inject this kind of like intense emotion into it as well. This songs about personal struggle, about pain, loss, anxiety, depression, and dealing with all those emotions, grappling with them, but also fighting with them and fighting through them. And that's what makes this album not just sort of like a pity party of kind of like adolescent angst. No, it feels very adult to me. It feels like it's taking a look at these emotions, it's living with them, it's this like cathartic element of expressing them, but it's also about fighting them. And the last track on the album, He Will Fight Savagely, I mean, that could be the title of the album too. This album fights savagely. So I could talk about the technical aspects of this music, but I feel like that would sort of be missing the point, because all of those technical things are just summoned to create this story, to create this vibe, to create this mood. Okay, but that being said, I will talk a little bit about the music and what makes it so cool. So you have, kind of like with Nile, their riffs are really jagged, complex. They're also almost like solos in their own right. They kind of go surprising directions. So in this like intense wall of sound that they're creating, you have these wandering atonal melodies. You have some chugging riffs. You have these blistering fast arpeggios and scales. You have these kind of like surprisingly almost pretty melodies that like appear for a second and then disappear. And in the background you have these kind of like pulsating synths that rise up now and again, and they're not like a contrast to the death metal, they're fully mixed into it and they're just amping up the intensity. It's kind of like if someone were playing the piano with their fists, with the damper pedal down, and then when that wasn't intense enough, they started playing with their face and their elbows. Like, that's the vibe that I'm getting here. So in addition to the crushing guitars and synths, the drummer's just absolutely killing it. If I had to compare them to someone, it would be kind of reminiscent of Flo from Cryptopsy. So really intense, full-on brutal drumming, lots of intense blast beats that keep getting switched up, but it also has this like kind of like improvised jazzy feel. They're playing around the riffs, not always just supporting, playing, laying down the beat, but playing against the beat, playing around it. And yeah, just the musicality is just off the walls on this album. So dense, so intense, so fragmented, so dissonant, that it's kind of at the limit of what you're able to stand, at the limit of what a human ear is like able to take in. But they walk that line perfectly, and they never veer to the point where you're just like, no, this is too much, turn it off. Like, it's always grabbing you back in and then pushing you away with the intensity and then pulling you back for a little bit, giving you a breather. And the way they navigate that tension and release and just the huge intensity that they're bringing while still making it listenable music, fucking incredible. This is the death metal album that I have been waiting for. This is what I have been wanting all along. Holy shit. It is packed to the gills with musical interest, musical complexity, with intensity, but again, that's all serving this larger purpose, this like emotional intensity that hits you on a gut level every time. And so, you know, it was never really a question. Once I heard this album, I was like, you know, unless something fucking insane happens, this is going to be my #1 album for the year. And every album that I listened to since then, there have been so many that I loved, but I, you know, it always weighs them against this, and I'm like, you know what? Doesn't quite top it. It's got to be Vitriol, my #1 of 2024. All right, thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you feel moved to comment, if there's anything I missed, anything that should be on the list, anything that you really agree with that I said, I'd love to hear it in the comments, so bring it on. I'd love to read it. All right, well, that's it for today at the Splatter Cafe. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.